I have an unconventional job in the field of information technology, which allows me to work from home. However, it also means that I work night shifts. On a cold February night a few years ago, while I was engrossed in my work, I suddenly heard the noise of the coat rack in the living room rattling, as it does when someone opens the door. Initially, I thought it might be my cat playfully climbing on the coats, as she often does when she's full of energy. I wanted to intervene before she could damage my new jacket. But to my surprise, instead of finding my mischievous feline, I was faced with a complete stranger. He immediately demanded to know where his belongings were, while I insisted for about 5 minutes that I had no idea who he was. As time went on, his threats became more aggressive. My phone was in another room, and I hesitated to turn my back on this person because my instincts told me he could pose a danger. He appeared intoxicated, possibly under the influence of something else as well, as his aggression escalated rapidly. The fact that he had somehow entered my apartment terrified me. I was completely clueless about the situation unfolding before me. Fortunately, I was saved by an umbrella I had received as a Christmas gift the previous year. It was an elegant umbrella with a handle resembling that of a Japanese katana. I had done some research, and it cost me nearly 200 quid, but it was worth every penny and more. Its realistic appearance made me slightly uncomfortable when carrying it in public. The umbrella was retractable, resembling a smaller katana rather than a large sword. I can't recall the specific name, but I'm sure someone in the comments would be able to help me with that. Additionally, it had a synthetic leather sheath, making it look even more like a small sword when holstered. This particular feature saved me from an uncertain fate that night. I swiftly grabbed the umbrella and grasped the handle as if I were about to unsheath a sword. Surprisingly, it had a powerful effect on the intruder. He instinctively raised his hands in a gesture pleading for mercy, as if I were holding a weapon. He began retreating, promising to leave if I allowed him to. However, I unintentionally obstructed his path to the exit, so I had to cautiously maneuver around him to provide an escape route. All the while, I couldn't help but worry that if he called my bluff, I would be defenseless, armed only with an umbrella. I had no idea if he was carrying any weapons. Fortunately, he didn't, and armed solely with a bloody umbrella, I managed to escort him out of my flat, slamming the door shut behind him. Following that ordeal, I hurried to my bedroom, which also served as my office at the time, and immediately called the police. To this day, I remain bewildered as to how the intruder gained access to my flat. The police speculated that I may have accidentally left the door unlocked, but they advised me to change the locks just to be safe. Although it wasn't the most reassuring outcome, there was little else they could do. Regrettably, I never apprehended the individual, so I still don't know why he invaded my home. It continues to trouble me. And now I always double-check when I close my front door at night, just in case it was simply a bizarre mistake that led to one of the most terrifying encounters of my life. After my time in the Army, I settled down in a remote area of Arkansas. Living alone, my budget constraints led me to choose an affordable option, a spacious but neglected 3-bedroom, 2-story house. The realtor probably assumed I would renovate it, but all I needed was a secluded place away from the hustle and bustle. It served its purpose perfectly. The house sat right by the highway, with a dirt road connecting it to a few neighboring properties a couple of acres away. One night, around midnight, while I was still awake in my PC room, which overlooked the front porch through a window, something caught my attention. The room was dimly lit, and suddenly, I could swear I heard voices emanating from the porch. Alert and on edge, I strained to listen, but the words remained indiscernible. Nonetheless, my conviction that someone was speaking persisted. In those days, the front door and most windows of the house lacked blinds or any means of covering them, except for the one in my office. It was a vulnerability I hadn't addressed yet, given my isolated location. Consequently, I seldom bothered to lock my doors. Now, looking back, I think the front door might have been locked, but in that moment, I couldn't recall. Moreover, there were too many exposed windows to simply walk up and secure them, at least according to my paranoid mindset. Thankfully, most of the lights were off, allowing me to stealthily retreat to my bedroom located down the hallway. With a surge of caution, I retrieved my shotgun, locked the bedroom door, and positioned myself in wait. I distinctly remember placing my iPhone at the base of the door, activating the camera to survey the connecting hallway. This makeshift surveillance was my attempt to monitor any potential intruders who might have entered. Fortunately, I didn't spot anyone. Exhaustion eventually overtook me, and I managed to fall asleep a few hours later. Days later, I learned from a neighbor on the dirt road that their son, who had been arrested in another state, had managed to escape and sought refuge in that very house. It turned out that the voices I heard on my porch coincided with his return. The authorities eventually tracked him down and apprehended him. Astonishingly, his hiding place was only half a mile away from my residence. Back in the day, when I still lived with my parents in Idaho, their house was located in a remote area. This meant that I had to drive for about 20 minutes just to reach a county road. After that, it took another 40 minutes to reach the city where I went to school and worked. My routine involved attending school in the mornings and afternoons, and then bartending at a small steakhouse at night to earn some extra money for my expenses. Those shifts often extended well past 11 p.m., and afterwards, we had to break down and clean everything. It was not uncommon for us to finish up around 12:30 or 1 a.m. One particular night, I was driving home, utterly exhausted. As I reached the end of the paved road, I started speeding down a narrow dirt road. The darkness enveloped me, typical of the countryside, with only a small cone of headlights illuminating the path ahead. On both sides of the road, there were walls made of scrub brush and grass, creating a tunnel-like effect with scraggly branches. As I was going around a corner, something caught my eye in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, sending a plume of dust ahead of me. Through the dust, I saw a white figure hunched over, directly in the beam of my headlights. It had long legs and haunches resembling a jackrabbit, but it stood at an impressive height of 4 feet and had a somewhat lumpy appearance, reminiscent of illustrations from those chilling stories books, if you remember them. Needless to say, I was terrified and frozen in my driver's seat, desperately trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The figure swayed back and forth, shivering. Its shape was utterly perplexing. I stared at it for a solid minute, my car idling in the middle of the road, attempting to concoct a plausible explanation for this bizarre sight. But I was utterly stumped. Gradually, I started inching the car forward. As I drew closer, I could discern the muscular shapes and shiny fur of the creature. Suddenly, it hopped up, revealing what looked like a head with a long ear. It stretched up, transforming its entire shape, much like the creatures in those sci-fi movies. In that moment, I let out a terrified cry, probably sounding more high-pitched than I would care to admit. The creature remained mostly invisible, except for its white striped legs and underbelly. However, what I initially mistook for a large jet-black ball resting on the roadside stood up, revealing a portion of its body that had been concealed behind folded black legs. It staggered off into the bushes, seeking a spot to sleep where people weren't disturbing it with their high beams. I understand that you might be thinking I felt foolish afterwards, and indeed I did. But at that moment, when it rose up like some unfolding monstrosity, I swear I had never been so terrified in my entire life. I had no clue what I was looking at. Exhaustion had already played tricks on my eyes due to the darkness. It was the perfect storm of circumstances that made me believe I was facing a creature about to pounce on my car or something. Since that incident in the early 2000s, I have always been extra cautious when driving at night, particularly in the countryside. It's an entirely different experience out there, so take care when driving in the country at night, folks. It's a whole different ballgame. To begin, let me clarify that I was young, naive, and attempting to be helpful. I was working the night shift at a customer service job when I was around 19 years old. I am not physically strong, and I don't engage in regular exercise. Moreover, I never carried anything for self-defense because I didn't possess anything of significant value. At that time, I wasn't particularly concerned about the possibility of being robbed, as there were several bars nearby, and it was likely a weekend. One night, after finishing my shift at around 2 a.m. in Syracuse, New York, a person approached me as I got into my car, asking if I had a lighter. I politely informed him that I didn't have one. He then asked if he could catch a ride down the street. For some inexplicable reason, perhaps out of boredom or curiosity, I agreed. Looking back, I realize how foolish this decision was. We drove for about a quarter mile, and then he asked me to pull over. As he exited the vehicle, it became apparent that he was homeless. He walked over to a nearby bus stop and retrieved a makeshift cigarette and lighter from a concealed spot he had set up. He then returned to the car and requested a ride back, explaining that he lacked transportation. Against my better judgment, I thought, why not? And allowed him back in the car. We continued driving, engaging in some casual conversation. However, the situation took a drastic turn as soon as I pulled over again. Suddenly, he became eerily silent, fixating his gaze straight ahead. My heart sank, and thoughts of danger raced through my mind. I glanced at him and asked if everything was all right several times, then said my goodbyes, stating that I needed to head home. Whatever distressing episode he was experiencing seemed to dissipate, and he thanked me before exiting the car. I am approximately 80% certain that if I had shown panic, the situation would have escalated, potentially resulting in an attack. He had a certain look about him, as if he was contemplating something terrible but lacked the resolve to carry it out. Perhaps my ability to connect with him on a personal level deterred him, or maybe he simply didn't perceive anything of value in me. Since that incident, I have adopted a strict policy of not giving rides to strangers. It may appear unfair, especially considering that I must take responsibility for my own poor judgment in that situation. However, I no longer feel comfortable exposing myself to the potential risks involved in offering rides to unfamiliar individuals. You may find it strange, but when I was a child, I had a peculiar ritual. Whenever I struggled to fall asleep, I would go to my bedroom window and gaze out into the night. There was something about the tranquility and darkness that fascinated me. I would reassure myself by thinking that everyone else was sleeping, and I should be too. Then I would proceed to count our neighbors, imagining them peacefully asleep. Next, I would count various animals, convincing myself that they were also in a deep slumber. This routine would eventually make me feel drowsy enough to return to bed and drift off to sleep. However, one particular night shattered my peaceful routine and sent me sprinting to my parents' room in sheer terror. As usual, I was engrossed in my window ritual when, out of nowhere, I witnessed someone vaulting over our backyard fence. It was undoubtedly a person, as it was far too large to be an animal. Yet, the way they moved seemed unnaturally peculiar. Looking back, I realized they might have been a criminal or someone being pursued by the police. However, in that moment, bathed in moonlight, they appeared like a nightmarish creature. The person cautiously scanned their surroundings, their head darting frantically, before concealing themselves behind a bush. I was petrified, fearing they would launch an assault on our home. Time seemed to stretch on endlessly as I anxiously waited for any signs of the authorities. After a few agonizing minutes, they stealthily approached our house and vanished into the darkness. It was then that panic consumed me, and I rushed to my parents, wailing about an impending monster attack. Initially, my parents dismissed it as a bad dream, but when I insisted that something lurked outside, attempting to infiltrate our sanctuary, my father's demeanor abruptly changed. He grabbed an old Louisville slugger from the bedroom closet and marched downstairs, ready to confront the intruder. To my relief, no one was there. I presumed the person had fled after realizing they couldn't breach our property, but in that moment, I was inconsolable. The fact that my father armed himself before investigating confirmed my belief that we faced imminent danger. I dreaded the thought of my dad getting hurt, as there would be no one left to protect me. This fear triggered a full-blown panic attack until my father returned and finally reassured me. My parents still recount this tale, most recently to a girl I was dating, who found it equally amusing. I suppose, in hindsight, I find it amusing too. After all, I was just a frightened child. Nevertheless, I swear the memory of that night remains etched in my mind, a testament to the intense fear I experienced, even after all these years.